Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My task is to give a bit of a regional perspective on education in this part of the world. And before I do that, I actually want to comment that I was asked to speak at a similar gathering of donors, philanthropies across the world, focusing on low and middle income countries. And Patricia, the webinar you set up is far fancier than that one. That was just a simple Zoom call. You all have gone way beyond that, so congratulations. If the slides can come up, as we start, we basically want to do three things. I want to start off by going into Kenya briefly, then we'll come out of Kenya and talk about the international experience, and then we'll come back to Kenya and make some comments about the implications of the international experience on philanthropy and funding and donors here in Kenya. Next slide. So I want to start off with some bad news from Kenya. This is a graph of data that we're looking to think about with respect to the magnitude of learning loss that came as a result of COVID-19. Now, we actually are working with Exams Council, NEC. Starting next week, we'll be doing a national assessment of learning outcomes at a country level to actually see whether or not this model data matches the reality. But this has actually been published in a study that has covered 10 different countries worldwide that's looking at the magnitude of learning loss that came as a result of being out of school. So if you bear with me, we can look on the left side of the screen, which has fluency. This is the number of words correct a child could read. It doesn't actually matter what the outcome measure is, but the point is relatively the same across various metrics. So the higher, the better. So if you look at October 2019, about when kids end school, normally at the end of grade 1, they would be reading around 13 words a minute. And if you look at October 2020, in a normal world, they would normally have gotten to around 25. So from 13 to 25, that's the normal growth in Kiswahili in grade 2. But we don't have a normal year last year. So we want to talk a little bit about what the likely outcomes are, what the current status is of learning in Kenya and other countries. Again, this is model data. We'll actually get real data from this starting next week. But we know from Malawi that the normal time outside of school represents some loss. So basically between October and December 2019, you see that kind of dotted line suggesting some loss. That when children are out of school, they might not be your kids, but the normal kid in rural Kenya doesn't have access to as many materials as your kids might have. So they might reduce their learning outcomes a bit. This actually, there's evidence for that in the US and UK as well. But what normally would happen is there's like a dip when you get to around December 2019 and a pretty rapid increase from 2019, beginning of academic year through the end of the academic year. We know that the outcomes, the timing for this year is different, but it's different in two ways. Let's look what it would normally happen through the beginning of the academic year until March 2020 when schools closed. There's a loss because in 2020 we'd only reached about 1/3 through the academic year, and so we have kind of the opportunity cost of that March to the end of the year when schools were closed on the one hand, and on the other hand we had the deterioration of skills that happens when children are out of school. So if we just took the kind of cutoff point of March 2020, this figure would suggest we would lose around 70% of learning. But if you include the fact that actually skills might deteriorate, not just be static, the loss is even higher, 114%. Now, I know it's not quite that bad, but that's assuming that there hasn't been any distance learning efforts that we know there have been here in Kenya. And the last measure, I don't even want to talk about because it's a bit too depressing. But we have this analysis that's in a paper that's recently published worldwide across low and middle income countries. If we can go to the next slide. But the basic point is that there's likely large-scale learning loss as a result of COVID-19 that's somewhere in that 70% to 114% of learning. Let's go to the next slide, please. So there's some hope that all the efforts that we did, that Sarah Ruto's government ministry did to kind of reduce learning loss. We don't have estimates of that yet from Kenya, but as I said, we will soon. But this is data from South Africa. So South Africa has a lot of advantages for those of you who are philanthropies who work across sub-Saharan Africa. It has a pretty significant television system, it has a pretty significant radio system, and it has materials that went home to every kid, including workbooks at large scale. And so if any country had the chance to allow distance learning efforts to make a difference, it's South Africa. And without going to the details of this data, basically what a recent study came out about 2 weeks ago to show that the magnitude of learning loss, comparing the outcomes right now with the outcomes of the previous year, was almost exactly the same amount of time the kids were outside of face-to-face school. I'll say that again. Basically, even with all of the efforts that they did in South Africa, distance learning, books sent home, everything else, the loss year on year of learning was almost exactly the same amount of loss that there was when it comes to how much time was out of school. So what are we saying? Distance learning efforts. I think Kenya was a real leader in the region, but I think we should be really clear-eyed that the loss of COVID-19 was pretty substantial. Next slide. And as a result of this, the main point is we need to think of business as usual not working. We are in a situation in 2021 into 2022 where the average kid, not my kid, not your kid, but the average kid here in Kenya who doesn't have a computer, doesn't have a tablet, doesn't have all these activities on Zoom, they have lost learning. And so business as usual from a philanthropy point of view and from an implementation point of view won't work. So that's the Kenya situation. What are some of the implications of that? There's substantial loss, and I think going to what John Mugo said at the beginning, I don't think the loss is evenly distributed. He was comparing Kiambu to places like West Pokot. I think it's not just that learning outcomes are not the same, but the learning loss is not evenly distributed. Those who are poor, those who are rural kids are going to have suffered even more. So if we're thinking about targeting philanthropy efforts and targeting support, it's those parts of the country that make the biggest difference. And the fundamental thing that matters is focusing on teaching to help catch up. I'm a real advocate for education interventions to improve outcomes, but I think fundamentally those outcomes depend on better teaching, depend on teachers having more time, depend on having teachers having more support to improve the quality of their pedagogy. So I'm not sure what you're thinking about doing from a philanthropy point of view, a funding point of view, but ultimately those things should support improved teaching, should support teachers dealing with the complexity of an even broader range of outcomes within their classroom. We need better pedagogy, we need better teaching. And how do we help that in the context of the CBC rollout? So there's some things we know about scale, and this is where I want to kind of focus my talk. Next slide. There's a recent study that was done that we did. It's called Learning at Scale. It was to identify the 8 most successful large-scale programs in the world that's focused on low and middle-income countries. And you can see the map that shows where those programs were derived from. 3 in South Asia and 5 here in Sub-Saharan Africa. These are programs that are both large-scale and highly effective. The reason why we focused on large scale and highly effective is because it's somewhat easy in quotes, to make impact when the program is at small scale or in pilot, or if you had a lot of supervision of the program, but it's quite a challenge to show large scale impacts. So these 8 programs are some of the ones that across the world have shown significant learning outcome improvement across the country. 2 in India, 1 in Pakistan, and then 5 in Sub-Saharan Africa, including 1 here in Kenya that we had the opportunity to support the government on. Next slide. We want to share a little bit about what we found from these programs that might be relevant as you're thinking about what to do to support here in Kenya. The first thing is that a lot of these programs emphasized phonics-based instruction. They weren't necessarily purely phonics, but they did help children teach letters and sounds. Number 2, there was a lot of explicit support for teachers. Number 3, they had increased instructional time. So much of the teaching task is hard and it's there's so much complexity, but if you can just help teachers to teach longer and spend more time pedagogically with kids, it makes a difference. Number 4, there was a lot of pedagogical time focused on reading, the skills of literacy. Number 6, students, not just teachers, but students had in their hands literacy materials that they could use on a daily basis. So programs that were able to get the ratio of learning materials down so that every child had access themselves. The next one, they had a variety of instructional activities. They were active, they were practice, they were interacting, there were small groups. There was lots of different ways. It wasn't just, as I heard Les say earlier, it wasn't just chalk and talk. It wasn't just standing in the front and having lecture. These programs had a variety of activities. And the last point I said earlier, just there's active student engagement and learning. So that's what it looked like in the classroom. The next one is about what does it look like to help teachers get to that. The number one was that teachers had practice. My experience with teachers here in Kenya and sub-Saharan Africa and this part of the world, teachers want to do well. The teachers get a really bad name, which I don't think is fair. They want to do well, but they need to have support and practice, the actual opportunity to do the new thing. It's not just hearing about it. It's not just training that's about the information of what the new materials or the new program looks like. CBC trainings really need to focus on and do focus on the skills of implementing the change. That's what we found in these 8 programs. The trainings were face-to-face, which is hard in the COVID era. So how can we be creative around smaller groups or supporting face-to-face training with some technology-based supports, including SMS. Coaches were structured, so these teachers just didn't teach. They had some support from a coach outside of the school or from their head teacher. A lot of these programs, 6 of the 8 had teachers' guides that simplified the instructional practice. Students had one-to-one books. The teacher support system was a positive and collaborative one where teachers were not just told all the things they did wrong, but supported on how to improve it in a relationship that they appreciated. They had increased confidence, and then the teacher support was about solving problems. Large-scale instructional reform isn't simple. The CBC implementation across the country is really laudable. It's exciting to see what's possible there, but they need to have the support that follows up to help them deal with the challenges of implementation as they move forward. The third category of findings was around the system. So that's the next slide. So it was teaching on the one hand, support to the teachers on the next, and then this system support. That there was quite a bit of emphasis on clear prioritization. These highly effective programs didn't try and do everything. They tried to focus at the system level, down from Sarah's level, all the way to the county, sub-county, and zone, to be able to focus on a few key things to do really well. These programs were really aligned with existing government plans. These were not external things that were fully implemented by donors. These were embedded inside of government systems. I think the era for us thinking that small-scale NGOs can just do things on their own should really be over. It's about how to help government do their work better. Number 3, it really was about the program communicating the expectations for improvement down the system to know exactly what needs to happen and how. And there was monitoring by government. There was program supervision by government, and that there was a fundamental amount of capacity building so that the skills from this individual program could be transferred across the broader sector. So those are some findings across these 8 highly effective programs. Go to the next slide. I won't go so much into detail here about what we know about scale in Kenya. There are 2 programs I want to highlight. One was just in the video you saw a moment ago called Tayari, which is funded by Children's Investment Foundation, who I think are here. That was a program focused on pre-primary. There's also Tusome, which was a grade 1 to 3 program. And in both of those interventions that are large scale and were effective here, they had books for every learner, teachers' guides to support the teachers to implement, that allowed them to have some flexibility, but did give them some support on how to teach well. There was a teacher training that's about skills, practice, implementation. What does it look like in your classroom before you leave the training? And then heavy coaching and teacher support. These kind of programs make a difference. The next slide shows you the president of Kenya launching the Tusome program at national scale. The next slide shows you the impacts. I won't go into much detail, but basic findings was that between the baseline and midline, the learning outcomes doubled at a national level. Next slide. In the Tayari program, this is the 4 counties you heard in the video a moment ago. So we had a range from Nairobi, including in the informal settlements, Laikipia County, which is complex, Uasin Gishu, both in Eldoret as well as the surrounding more rural areas, and then Siaya. So a range of locations where this Tayari CD program work funded by SIF. Next slide. And without going into the details, learning outcomes had a substantial improvement across a variety of metrics. Next slide. So I want to wrap up with some implications. Going back to the main point, push against business at scale. If I was a donor, if I was a philanthropy, these are things I would be thinking about. How can you push against business as usual? We have to do things different in 21 and 22 to be able to not only improve outcomes for those who are left behind, as John's presentation showed, but also to help catch up from learning loss. How do you design programs for scale? How do you think about tens of schools or hundreds of schools if you can afford it, rather than just a handful, because there's millions of kids here who need improvement. Instruction programs can work if they're done well. It's really about implementation. How do you push for tight links? I think some philanthropy work is really focused on just, I'm going to do one thing. But if we're thinking about the change pedagogically, teachers need support across a variety of metrics, across a variety of interventions, the materials, the coaching, and the support down the system. How do you advocate for data and accountability? I think Kenya is one that's quite excited. Kenya is a country that's quite excited and has shown the ability to have data support and instructional change process in healthy ways. I'm excited about some of the work that's happening on NEMIS and other dashboards to be able to support the availability of data on learning improvement across the local level. How do we use teachers' guides that can help teachers to scaffold? How do we, as we said earlier, how do we push against normal in quotes, which is kind of just sit and listen, but instead be able to have skills and practice as the CBC is asking for? And how do you push and use resources? The link there is to some materials that we've worked on across a few countries to support how to do this at large scale. I want to go to the next slide and just be able to say that this is the resources that I'm talking about. Last one, just to say thanks to everyone. I think my summary would be to say Kenya is an example where large-scale programs can work, and Kenya is a place where there's a system in place led by government officers who really care about improving learning at large scale. And so I think we're all fortunate to be part of the education system in this sector. Thank you, everyone.
To overcome inequality and enhance economic growth.